Bloodtide Receded, Chapter 1, Skyrim. Helgen, Autumn, 17th Last Seed, Year 201 of the Fourth Era. It was always cold in the mountains, a cold that soaked into soil and stone, freezing the morning mists into spectral wraiths that moaned their displeasure through the rocky gullies and towering heights. This was the home of the winds in the mountains, the stabbing fingers of the snow-capped earthbones that loomed over those travelling between Cyrodiil and Skyrim. Today, however, it was home to more than just the chill of approaching winter and closed mountain passes. Among the dozens of legionaries arrayed in disciplined, if somewhat relaxed ranks, Hadvar shivered, feeling the breeze across his flesh and cursing whichever legion paper shuffler had decided to issue the legionaries in Skyrim Cyrodiilic uniforms. Cyrodiil and Skyrim may have had millennia of history, cultures, and exchanged blood and trade, but climates were certainly not something they shared by any stretch of the imagination. Thin layers of leather and metallic strips did little more than creak and sway in the breeze, allowing the morning chill to caress his bare thighs and leaving him wishing for an additional layer of true Nordic furs, preferably snow wolf or bear, but at that moment he would have settled for a moth-eaten sheep's carcass. They're late. Bordering on the edge of his peripheral vision, Hadvar glanced at one of his fellow legionaries as he muttered what their entire formation was thinking, the words misting into existence from the cold. It is a bit of a climb through the pass to Ivarstead. Hold your tongues. Like a crack of a whip, a voice snapped through them, and as one they instinctively twitched, as weeks of drills caused ingrained obedience without conscious thought. Her flesh was dark, a sign of the rich Yakundan heritage that she wore as proudly as her scars from the Great War. Even under the cheek guards and the somewhat closed nature of her horsehair-crested helmet, Centurion Turin's expression was baleful and challenging to those under her command, and even the more obstinate among them would never think of crossing their veteran commander. It certainly didn't help that they were all fresh recruits, so green they could be mistaken for Spriggans, and as such she intimidated them through sheer force of personality without needing to fall back on her authority. Hadvar, front and centre. Dressed in full legion plate, and the thick hide of a snow wolf wrapped around her shoulders, the centurion glanced over the Nordic legionary as he took several short, precise paces towards her before snapping to attention. Any other time, Hadvar's Nordic heritage would have left him towering over the smaller Redguard woman, but personality, presence, and rank ensured that Centurion Turin cast a shadow over her short soldiers, figuratively and literally. Their lordships have deemed us worthy enough to be provided a list of our expected guests. A sheet of parchment and a stick of charcoal was thrust towards him, atop a plate taken from a nearby tavern with only marginally less threat than the sharpened gladius. When they arrive, you will need to cross each name off the list to ensure we got them all. Despite the tenseness and the terse nature of his commander, Hadvar knew it wasn't directed at him. They were all on edge, from the lowest-ranked legionary to the highest-ranked member among them all, as they stood in the streets of the tiny hamlet of the mountains, with a small group of elves seated on their horses watching their every move. That, and the weight of expectation of why they were in such a backwater border town in the mountains of Skyrim. The parchment was nothing special, some sort of easily acquired, mass-produced sheet of undefinable origins, but the inked names were an entirely different matter. With a glance, Hadvar felt his guts turn to ice, looking over the list and seeing more than one name that he recognized, but it was the first that truly kept his attention. Ulfric, he breathed. They managed to catch Ulfric. There was a clank and a scrape of metal as the captain nodded. The general managed to ambush the Stormcloak leadership near Darkwater Crossing. Then, what are we here for? Escort duty? Eyes that had seen immense death and conflict in the war decades before burrowed into Hadvar's as Centurion Turin slowly and carefully shook her head before nodding down the road. The nod this time was directed to the burly smith of their cohort, scraping a whetstone along an enormous battle-axe, sitting on a wooden block and whistling a depressive funeral dirge with a blackened hood draped over a knee. This time, the chill that coursed through Hadvar at the sound of the low whistling tune and the scrapes of metal was not born of the mountains. Over the sounds of Helgen, eking its existence in the rocky heights of the Gerald Mountains, a long, drawn-out horn echoed, cutting through the moans of the wind and acting as heralds to the sounds of hooves, and despite himself, Hadvar glanced around. Little more than a border post that had grown like a weed, Helgen was a backwater, and was utterly insignificant in the face of the Empire and Tamriel. Homes, taverns, stables, and farriers. Helgen was nothing but a stopping point between more important places, and Hadvar realized of a start that it was for this reason alone was why the village had been chosen as a rendezvous. Following his centurion's lead and acting as her shadow, they moved away from the formation into the tiny central square between the pair of mouldering towers that overlooked the collection of huts and buildings. The sounds of hooves and the squealing of poorly greased axles were making themselves felt. Winter was still many weeks away, but the temperatures of the higher passes had made the journey difficult nonetheless for the approaching wagons. Wheels would have slipped on frost-covered stones. Tallow rubbed into wheels and suspensions for lubrication hardened and cracked, and even the oil coating the metal hinges and axles had worn away. Northern-bred horses, their coats gleaming with moisture, filled the air with hot, humid gouts of steaming breath that was snatched away by the breeze as they hauled half a dozen open-topped wagons crammed with dejected souls. There was little conversation amongst the prisoners, only a handful muttering amongst themselves as they looked over the collection of legionaries and other assorted dignitaries that awaited them. The legion smith with the two-handed axe standing before the block of wood did little for their spirits, especially now that his features were hidden behind the blackened leather mask, but determination and hatred still burned in their eyes. Grimaces of resentment and twisted mouths into snarls of discontent and challenge, as well as attempting to starve off the bitter wind. They were cold, hungry, and covered with various injuries and livid bruises from their capture, but nearly every single one of them glared intensely at the collection of mounted elves astride their thoroughbreds. If the robed and armoured Mer noticed the expressions of hatred sent in their direction by the captured stormcloaks, they chose not to react, instead staring ahead and exchanging words with the immaculately dressed general in his polished plate and robes. They especially chose to ignore the collection of similar expressions burning from among the ranks of the legionnaires at their presence, as there were more than a few, legionnaires and stormcloaks alike, who had fought against them in the Great War. Instead, they remained as aloof and poised as only such diplomatic representatives could be. General Tullius, sir, riding over on a steed of his own, an extraordinary clad in maroon cloak, approached the elves and his commander, thumping his fist against his breastplate in salute. The headsman is waiting. Good. Like many under his command, General Tullius had the same reservations of the presence of the elven diplomats in such a situation, but age and his rank allowed him the pleasure of showing his true feelings in the matter, cutting off the elves in mid-sentence as he tugged his steed's reins and guiding it away. Let's get this over with. From house to smithy, tavern to watchtower, a ripple of commotion flowed with the passage of the wagons, the mood of Helgen's inhabitants darkening as though the sun had been hidden by the clouds. Several of the locals ushered their children inside, glaring at those responsible for bringing the pall of death and hostile interests to their tiny community. Windows were shuttered, doors thunked closed as they were barred and locked, and what was typically a community of life and colour transformed until it was as empty like a tomb and as welcoming as a graveyard. Clattering and squealing of protesting axles, the wagons were pulled to a stop in a tiny square as each of the drivers pulled back the reins and soothingly called them to a stop. In a row of wood, leather, and horseflesh, they rolled to a halt, jostling some of the passengers when a driver pulled a little too hard, and finally coming to rest from the journey to a chorus of voices. Get those prisoners out of the carts, snapped Centurion Turin, her words framed by the clinking of metal, muted by the furs and cloak that she wore as she moved towards a cart. Move it. Where are we? Why are we stopping? Why do you think? End of the line. Practically growling the words out like a captured snow bear, one of the captured stormcloaks scowled as he beheld Hadvar in his legionnaire's armour. There was a moment of anger in the ice-blue eyes that was quickly crushed. Let's go. Shouldn't keep the gods waiting for us. One by one, the prisoners dismounted from the backs of the wagons. Some dropped with a lithe ease, while others needed some assistance from legionnaires to clamber down from a combination of bonds, lack of dexterity, or by just wanting to resist in some small manner. No, wait, we're not rebels. Hard expressions carved on bearded faces glanced at one of the skinny, almost malnourished figures of their number, stammering in fear, twisting in his bonds, and struggling even as a pair of legionaries grabbed him and hauled him bodily off the back of a wagon. Face your death with some courage, thief. The venom that dripped from every word was potent enough to burn holes into the cobblestones beneath the Stormcloak's feet, practically glaring at his fellow prisoner, being shoved into their huddled group. You've got to tell them, we weren't with you. This is a mistake. Hadvar started as the loud voice of Captain Turin bellowed further commands, ordering the miserable group to step toward the executioner's block when their name was called. With a quick look and a nod of command from his centurion, Hadvar cleared his throat, raised the list to his eyes, and read the first name. Ulfric Stormcloak. His mouth was suddenly dry, feeling parched as he choked out the words, Jarl of Windhelm. Chapter 2. Bloodtide Receded. The chorus of calls from the prisoners echoed through the village, and several of them stamped their feet in honour of the man who stepped forward. As the only member in the group who had not been stripped of his possessions and most of his clothes, the Jarl towered over the men at his back, and the legionnaires to his front. Dressed in rich robes and furs, he cut a figure that looked somewhat constrained and unnatural, even despite the circumstances, an appearance that wasn't helped by the thick cloth gag stuffed into and around his mouth. It was almost as though his body, one hardened and tempered in the flames of war, protested the lack of armour surrounding it and yearned for fighting again. It has been an honour, Jarl Ulfric. Quiet. Snarling, and without a moment's hesitation, one of the nearest legionnaires slammed a fist into the kidney of the Stormcloak who called out. Ralof of Riverwood. Spitting at the feet of the legionary who hit him, Ralof glared at the plated soldier for a heartbeat before striding forward, but the whole time his eyes were locked into Hadvar's for every step. Neither of them were unaware of the eerie symbology of such a moment, one dressed in the ragged remains of the Stormcloak's heraldry, the other in the pristine armour of an imperial legionnaire. Seeing his childhood friend standing with hands bound as a prisoner was always a sobering moment, but Hadvar's guts twisted into rotten coils as he struggled to remain impassive. Many, many years before there would have been camaraderie and friendship between the two of them, but now there was nothing more than simmering hatred that only a civil war could infuse into hearts and minds. Lokir of Rorikstead. Almost to prove their differences, the twisting, fearful weed of a man looked about with a dawning horror in his face, and as his name was called, horror and realization dawning in his expression as his eyes moved over to the executioner's block. No, I'm not a rebel. You can't do this. With legionaries advancing on all sides, his attempts to hide within the group of prisoners were for naught, and out of pure desperation he reacted entirely on instinct. Shrinking away from the legionaries advancing on him, he suddenly broke out into a run, shouldering his way through the crowd of Stormcloaks and past the grasping hands. One of the legionnaires tried and failed to grasp the fleeing figure, staggering as the skinny Nord picked the first direction he was facing and began to run, legs pumping and breath steaming in the frigid air. Halt! The snap of the command rippled through every soldier in earshot, legionary or stormcloak alike, as Centurion Turin stormed forward, face flushed in blinding rage. "You're not going to kill me." Murmuring grew, soft prayers to the gods and muttered oaths half spoken on tongues as Lokius sprinted with all his legs could manage. Neither the pain of his bare feet being sliced open on the rough cobblestones, nor the freezing temperatures in his lungs seemed to trouble him, adrenaline flooding his veins as he did everything in his power to flee. From their positions in the town square, there was little that any of the legionaries were capable of stopping the runaway, especially as fully laden in armour, leather and furs as they were. There was no way that any of the soldiers would be capable of catching a man dressed in rags and fueled by terror. "Archers!" Turin snapped, turning and watching as a pair of chain-mailed foresters began fumbling with their quivers in response to her command. A bow was raised and a string drawn back, and soon the first slap cracks of bows releasing tension reached everyone's ears. For several moments it appeared as though he would make the safety of the streets curve and the corners of the buildings, hemming it in. The first few arrows skidded across the cobblestones or ripped through the air around the fleeing man as nervous fingers snatched at bowstrings, but it was inevitable. Within meters of perceived safety, a goose-feathered arrow punched into his ribs between his shoulder blades, plucking him from his feet as though tackled. "Anyone else feel like running?" Above the choking gurgles of the wounded man, the centurion's voice filled the sudden silence as prisoners and soldiers alike watched as one of the archers strode over to the wounded man. Even with an arrowhead in a lung, coughing bloody froth over his face and hands bound in front of him, he continued struggling to rise, squirming away from the approaching archer as he drew a dagger from its sheath. A quick, economical stab put an end to his attempts, and the desperate struggles turned into spasms as his life flowed from the wound in his throat. Feeling sickened at the sight, Hadvar brought the list back up before his face as he continued, reading from the list of names, ticking them off one by one as he went. It was a collection of names made famous in the rebellion, containing over 3 dozen individuals that included a majority of Ulfric's commanders and lieutenants. It was a powerful list, but he couldn't help but feel anger at the elvish deceit that would lead to the deaths of so many of his kinsmen. One by one, the captured Stormcloaks moved forward, shuffling with dejection or marching with their heads held high and proud as they went to their fate. The growing ranks standing before the chopping block increased, the tension filling the air with an almost palpable sensation that left the skin crawling. He reached the end of the list, ticking off the last of the names and quickly counting them. 31. 31 of his kinsmen, doomed to die at the chopping block. Not a single one bothered to hide or falsify their identities, choosing to step forward with their honour intact rather than resorting to some cheap, elfish trick to buy a few more minutes of life. But, despite the list and the names, there was one last individual standing before the wagons, staring at him, with an eyebrow slightly raised, as though amused at being missed. Wait. The confusion that filled Hadvar was quickly crushed at the sight of someone not on the list provided by the treacherous elves. Quickly checking it again, he sighed to himself. It stood to reason that in such an ambush, everyone who happened to be in the area would have been scooped up with the others. "You there, step forward." Without hesitation, the prisoner obeyed, striding across the cobblestones to present himself before the young legionary. Like the other prisoners, he stepped forward with a confidence that seemed entirely at odds with the situation, and the fact that he was half-dressed in tattered remains of his clothing, reduced to rags in the ambush that netted him with the Stormcloaks. He was tall, not overly so, like an Altmer or Nord, but was powerfully built. Instead of the brutish strength of the Northmen, there was a whipcord strength about him that suggested a dangerous and agile fighter. Yet, unlike the other prisoners, he was no Nord. With the build of a professional soldier and skin tanned from years in the elements, his home may have been in the south of Gerals, but with the darkening hints of Redguard blood in his veins. A distant ancestor, perhaps, but still giving his skin a healthy, sun-kissed appearance of strength and vitality. Dressed in rags like most of the other prisoners, he stood straight-backed and tall, matching Hadvar in his average 6-foot height. There was a moment of insecurity in Hadvar's mind as he saw the way the coiled muscles bunched and clenched in the prisoner's arms, the telltale swelling of his shoulder showing an archer's strength from years drawing a bow. The scars, though, were humbling, a little terrifying. Every inch of his flesh had felt the kiss of a blade or the punch of a dagger or arrow. In places, the skin was puckered and raised from where heat and flames had scorched the skin raw, and threading their way up his arms were dozens, if not hundreds of jagged nicks where blades had cut them. Whoever this man was, while he had the muscles of an archer, he was not someone who fought from afar, and certainly didn't shy away from revealing them to others. What was only partially curious to Hadvar, though, was he could see a trio of deep burns where someone had repeatedly pressed a hot bar of metal in what he guessed was an attempt to seal a set of terrible wounds. It was oddly placed, and only seemed to accentuate the remains of a fading legion brand under the ruined tissue on the bicep. Under any other circumstances, seeing an ex-legionary in such a state and prisoner of the legions he used to serve would have been unusual, but he wasn't the only one among those present with such a mark. Many of the Stormcloaks were indeed veterans of the Great War, and served the Empire with distinction, before the Civil War tested their true loyalties. Who are you? Hadvar asked, feeling his growing confusion at the way that the man stood there, watching with a predatory intensity. For a moment the prisoner regarded him with the piercing brown depths of his eyes. Despite the injuries and the scarring that would have put even some of the most vaunted veteran legionnaires of the Great War to shame, he looked to be in his mid-30s, except for his eyes. His eyes spoke of horrors and experiences that would quail the hearts of lesser men. There was a depth of age and knowledge of someone many years older than one such as he, and Hadvar involuntarily shivered as though his soul had been laid open. The scar under his right eye only increased the prisoner's intimidating presence, and unbidden, Hadvar recalled the tales his mother used to tell him of how the ancient knightly orders would gash their cheeks when they pledged their oaths of loyalty. For several moments the prisoner seemed deep in thought, looking about the group with all the emotion of someone on an afternoon stroll. There was amusement in the slightly raised corner of his mouth, as though laughing at a joke that only he knew or understood. To the steadily increasing annoyance of both Hadvar and Centurion Turin standing beside him, the scarred prisoner remained deep in thought, as though considering what name to give them. The grin lengthened as he looked over the legionary and his commanding officer, his face showing infinite amusement that somehow didn't manage to reach his eyes. It was almost as though he was bitterly amused at the whole situation, which put him entirely at odds with the other prisoners. Kaius, he said simply, as though coming to a decision before speaking. Kaius Treblinus Dessen.